interest in calcium and phosphorus throughout my career, but because of the sow mortality problem and the pelvic organ prolapses, we've looked at calcium supplementation to see if there's potential of problems associated with hypocalcemia in sows. And we were not able to detect that, but as a part of that research, we did realize that we really did not have good information on the phosphorus requirements of the sow.
Welcome to the Swine Nutrition Blackbelt Podcast, the latest swine nutrition research digested for you. I'm your host, Clayton Chastain, and today we have with us Dr. Tom Crenshaw, an animal science professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So Tom, it's been a little while since you've joined us. So before we get started today, would you mind giving the audience a brief introduction about yourself?
Okay, sure. Like Clay said, I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Animal Science Department. I did my graduate studies at Nebraska, master's and Ph.D. degree there. If you happen to still pick up a Southern accent, I'm originally from Tennessee. Did my undergrad work at the University of Tennessee at Martin. I've been at Wisconsin now for over 40 years.
Kemen calls all swine experts. You already know the key to a profitable swine operation is healthy, productive pigs. Our team of swine experts are driven by curiosity to create science-backed ingredients and solutions that help you maintain feed and water quality, improve intestinal health, optimize nutrition, and eliminate pathogens. Learn more today by diving in at kemen.com/swine.
Awesome. So I see your research as of late has focused on the phosphorus requirements of sows, in particular for over or under feeding, based on the current recommendations by NRC and other sources. So could you tell us a little bit about what all research you've been doing there?
Sure. I've had a long interest in calcium and phosphorus throughout my career, but because of the sow mortality problem and the pelvic organ prolapses, we've looked at calcium supplementation to see if there's potential of problems associated with hypocalcemia in sows. And we were not able to detect that, but as a part of that research, we did realize that we really did not have good information on the phosphorus requirements of the sows. So graduate student Mariel Grez, Cape DeVille, and I worked on a project where we intentionally went in and designed an experiment to determine phosphorus requirements. And it's much more difficult working with a sow. A lot of our work has been done using DEXA scans to determine whole body bone mineral content and using that as a way of estimating calcium and phosphorus requirements. That's very difficult to get a sow on the DEXA table and do a whole body scan. And as we dug into the literature a little bit, thought more deeply about it, we decided that we could actually use renal output, so urine excretion of calcium and phosphorus, as a way to determine the requirement rather than doing a complete fecal and urine collection. So we designed an experiment, dose response, and actually then came up with a fairly sound database on phosphorus requirements of the sow. But as we collected the urine, we realized that, as most of you listening in on this would know, that the urine volume that's excreted by the sow ranges quite a bit from, we saw basically a quart of urine of some sows to over 5 gallons or even 20 gallons of urine coming from different sows that were maybe even fed the same diet. So to try to account for that different concentration, we actually came up with a ratio, and so we measured the calcium to phosphorus ratio, and that removed a lot of the variation that we were seeing in just urine concentration. Then realized that that ratio would actually allow us to predict the requirement quite accurately. So if the body has excess calcium and phosphorus in the diet, it would eliminate what's absorbed into the body through the kidneys. And so we used that ratio, and rather than using that to determine an exact requirement, we were able to develop statistically, I'm going to call them just big buckets or categories that were described as either deficient, adequate, or excess phosphorus in the diet. And that, again, statistically fit quite well with our predictions of requirements. And so too often in academia and research that we do, we try to determine an exact requirement. and we want to know that single value, but there's a lot of variation in animals, even in the uniformity that we have in our genetics today. We have still a lot of variation that exists. So rather than determining an exact requirement, we decided we could fit big brackets and just know, is the animal deficient in phosphorus? Is it adequate in phosphorus, or is there excess? And we were able to predict that quite accurately. We have break-off categories that would allow us to do that prediction. And so that was a lot of Mariola's contribution through her Ph.D. program, is to develop this concept that we could predict requirements in larger brackets or categories without necessarily the need to determine an exact number. That changes then how we might approach meeting the requirements on a herd basis for sows, or even an individual farm basis. So if we could collect a urine sample, look simply at the calcium to phosphorus ratio, from that we would be able to predict the requirement of the animal just using that ratio. And it could be the whole herd. We might think about screening a herd. Let's say you've got a 5,000 sow herd. We often do this with serology, looking for disease status or the herd health status, and we collect blood samples to determine serology. Well, we would propose that we could take a urine sample and predict whether or not that herd was being overfed with phosphorus, being fed an adequate amount or deficient amount. And that might change from one location to the other within either operations, different production sites, may possibly even feed in some of the same ingredients. So we would propose that we could do a herd serology basis and then adjust the diets based on that individual herd, rather than trying to use what we've worked on now for years, and I would acknowledge that it's made a great contribution to the efficiency of phosphorus use, determining the digestibility of phosphorus in each feed ingredient that we use. And we know from research that's been done, people that have worked in those areas, that those digestibility values change. And then things that we do in the diet, different trace minerals or other nutrients or other ingredients that are supplemented, can change the digestibility values. But more recently, especially for sows, there's been evidence that the digestibility of phosphorus changes as a function of the stage of gestation, which makes it a real problem now for the nutritionists formulating the diets to make sure that they're accurately meeting that. The consequence of that is that we often overfeed to make sure that we've got enough. And that's kind of the safety factor that we use in diet formulation. And we're concerned that if we don't feed enough, we've compromised performance. So our research would say there's a different approach that could be used. And if you think about electronic feeders and even feeding individual animals, there would be a potential into the future that we could use a collection of urine from individual animals, get a rapid test to determine the urine calcium-phosphorus ratio, and then we would be able to feed the individual animal based on that animal's needs, rather than even the individual or the whole herd that animal's from, or apply that across the country to the calcium phosphorus requirements on a national basis based on kind of one value in our NRC publication that says that's the phosphorus requirement. So we end up overfeeding phosphorus a lot of times in the diets. And I think the audience would know now, and certainly a lot of talk about this, but we need to be aware of the consumer, in this case, of overfeeding phosphorus in the diet and what that does to surface water pollution. Runoff is really the problem with that. So manure management plans, if those are well managed, then we should be making a minimum contribution to surface water pollution from phosphorus. But yet traumatic rainfall events that do occur still contribute to that runoff. So the consumers, are concerned still about phosphorus in the environment. I think all of you know that we've changed a lot of our approach in meeting phosphorus from the inorganic phosphorus to use of phytase. If I got time, I got to make one quick comment here. When phytase first came out, and I've been around long enough, I can say this. I first heard about it, I said that would never work. Phytase is an enzyme, it's a protein, it's going to be broken down, it would never work. My wife likes to hear me say this. I can say, I'm wrong. I was wrong in that statement. Phytase works. It's a very effective ingredient that we add into the diet, but it's also created a lot of concerns and a lot of issues because certainly there are different phytase products that are on the market. They have a little bit different efficiencies. And then our understanding of how to balance the calcium-phosphorus ratio in the diet when we're using phytase also changes our approach to feeding the animal. And if we go back even with phytase and we're using a calcium to phosphorus ratio as a predictor of the adequacy of phosphorus, I think that can be a very useful tool. Now we need to do, the research to kind of prove in the diets with phytase that it works, but that calcium phosphorus ratio, I think, would be a better predictor than trying to determine the digestibility values of all these different ingredients or different combinations of ingredients that we use with and without phytase in the diet. So that's kind of an approach that we see into the future that can dramatically change how we go about assessing the phosphorus needs of the animal. We use need rather than requirement. So we fit them into a broader category, and then that should allow us to actually use the phosphorus with a greater efficiency in the diets. I might mention there's also concern, though, with overfeeding that phosphorus in the diet, and there may be consequences in the animal if we overfeed the phosphorus.
Gotcha. Well, I believe that's all the time we have for this episode, Tom. I know we have a lot more to discuss and cover here. So for the listeners, make sure to keep your eyes peeled. There will be a part 2 of this particular topic coming out later with Dr. Crenshaw and I. But that's all the time we have today. So thank you, Tom, for coming on the show. And to everyone else, thank you for listening to the Swine Nutrition Blackbelt Podcast. Please visit us at swinenutritionblackbelt.com. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast channels so you won't miss out on the next episode. See you next week.